All right, so next up in our ever eternal quest for discovering new things in Realflow is the vortex field. And if we take a look at my video example here again, I mean, it's kind of beside the point. This was a very steep decline. It would not, to be honest, have been necessary to have a vortex here. But I had to add something new, and it was the vortex. So here's the scene I used for this one. It's nothing real fancy going on here. I just created a hybrido domain, and I have a emission geo. You see there's a kind of like a cavity here going in, like a lip under the top row. And there I have another geo that is actually acting as the emitter. And then I have gravity foam ran after the fact, and a splash ran after the fact, and the mesh, of course, kill volume, couple of noise fields, and of course the vortex field in this case. Like I said, maybe it was a bit exaggerated, but I wanted to add that in this case, just to add something new. And let's take a look at how to tweak the vortex field. If you have like a hole in the bottom of a container or something, there will typically be vortex kind of appearing naturally. But in this case, for example, there's no suction towards the bottom like an empty cavity or something. There's just something going on here, like Pirates of the Caribbean type thing here from Louis M, who worked at Next Limit. So, I mean, let's just explore the vortex field. This will be a real quick demo. I have just used the basic large scale presets. The only things I have changed were that I lowered the water level to about half, and I set my display to be spheres of 0.05, and we have a particle count of about 130,000. So that's going to sim really quick for us. We have up here the vortex field. You can hook it up. You can connect it. And I'm going to just put it there. I'm not going to use the icon because I think it becomes a little cluttered. Let's just simulate a few frames. Let's see if we can make out what's going on. So by default, it's going to act on the whole domain. There's some, I mean, the force will be strongest around the object because it can't directly affect particles over here because they have other particles between them that they're going to have to collide with first. You know what I mean? So if you just use it like this, you're going to have kind of like a global effect. And I mean, we don't have to do that many frames. We can see it here. It's pushing the whole thing around. The typical thing would be to add a fall off. So let's enable a fall off and display the fall off. By default, it's a cube. I would say let's maybe go for a sphere. And then you can start transforming that sphere. You might need to troll this down, and you can say, I don't know, size of 5 maybe. Let's just sim one frame so that we actually get particles, so we see what we're dealing with. Maybe that's a bit much. Size of 3, let's try that. So what this means, essentially, the inner sphere represents 100% effect of the daemon, and towards the outer sphere, then the effect is going to have tapered off entirely. So then you can use the fall off percent, which is kind of going to control how wide or how smooth that transition is going to be. And then you can invert the fall off as well. So everything outside would be affected and vice versa. Fall off decay type, I mean, typically I just want to do this with linear, but I mean, you can play with those if you want to get a more gradual feel. Let's just sim a few frames again. So we have a bit of a hot spot here in the center now. It's pretty apparent if you look at the velocity. And now it's time to start playing with the actual vortex field attributes. So if you want, you can display the vortex field. I typically don't do that. The larger the arrows, the stronger the force field. It also gives you a clear idea of the direction. That might be something to maybe just enable this and figure out which way everything is going to flow. And I would probably only just keep that around for a quick while I dial everything in. So there's rotational strength, for example. Positive number is going to be a a clockwise rotation, which you could already see in the sim. But this is also a negative attribute if you want it to be. So if you start going negative, you're going to have it moving counterclockwise. So you can see the arrows have changed direction now. You can also see, if I just turn that off, you can see that on the icon itself. Counterclockwise, clockwise. So that depends on which hemisphere of the planet you're on, so to speak. And let's just dial that up from the default and sim again. So it's a bit hard to see. This is a pretty coarse sim, but now you can tell that we're starting to get kind of a hole in the middle here. If this would have been like deeper water, then it would have started forming a cone. You might have seen some nature footage of that when there's like cavities underground or something like that. And this is pretty cool if you ask me. Much like the example that we looked at, starting to form a pretty big hole in the middle. So that's pretty effectful if that's what you're going for. If it's not what you're going for, you can use the central strength attribute to counteract it. So if you go positive on this attribute, it's going to pull the liquid inwards to the center. And if you go negative, so if you want it to be even more apparent that it's pushing away from the center, you can start going negative on this. And that's probably what Miguel was using, and Luis Miguel was using in his example. So, I mean, I don't think we need to do much more in terms of the Vortex Daemon. I just wanted to show it to you. Open your eyes to another daemon, play around with it. Let's see what you can come up with. Would be cool to see. And to close this off, let's maybe just set the cell size to 0.1 and run this on the command line, and then I'm going to come back and we can see what it might look like with a little more detail. And I just had to run it again. I thought it became a little hard to make out the details in point mode. So I went back to spheres. So at least some amount of self-shading, even though they're not lit per se. And yeah, quite turbulent. Maybe I went a bit overboard with the settings, but I'll just leave it to you to play with. Personally, I mean, this is pretty cool. It almost makes me want to run this in high res and render it. But anyway, play around with the Vortex Daemon. And the second item on the agenda is just really just a PSA. I find that it's very easy to get confused with the misconception that hybrido can only exist within, you know, like a confined domain like this, like maybe what you have experienced from Maya fluids or whatever. And that's kind of like misleading in a sense. Now, I wouldn't say it's misleading, but I feel like I encounter a lot of misconception that people don't really know that you can also just create an open domain, and you can assign, you know, you can create an object and you can create an emitter with that object selected, and you can plug it in. Let's give it a stream and a constant velocity of, I don't know, 5. Kind of beside the point, but the reason I wanted to just bring this up is, you know, in case you're doing something similar. I mean, in my little scene here, what I was in fact doing was I was emitting from an object that was hiding under the lip of this collider here. And once the liquid exited this geo at the bottom, it would just go into a K-volume and get killed off and you know, keep the particle count to the bare minimum, what I needed. And that would be my way to set up if, you know, let's say I created this little river collider real quick. And I mean, let's say we were setting up something like a river sim. Now, I mean, I wouldn't want, you know, like a wave tank or like all of these kind of like this clutter that it creates. So I just wanted to you know, just let you know that you don't have to do it that way if you don't want to. So let me just set up real quick here, and maybe I'll speed this up. And I'm just going to take a look at the emitter itself. Should have a direction there. There we go. And I'm just going to bring the cell size down here to 0.1. I've connected up, the collider. Let's go with gravity. Let's go with drag. Just connecting everything up, and maybe a little noise field just for the fun of it. And I'm ready to go. Are you? This is how I would set it up. There's no need for like a big container or anything like that. That's just kind of like getting in your way and cluttering up your scene. Maybe I should have done this cube a little bigger. Oh, this one is not yet connected. So probably not give it as much. Now, of course, we still want to kill off particles and whatnot. Once they exit the volume, let's go and base this on the riverbed. So as soon as they get out of there, we're going to kill them off. Might want to just take it a little like that, and then connect this up. And I probably want to go way above here. In terms of resolution. And actually, this cube here should not be as high up. It should be kind of like intersecting. I'm going to keep it like that. And then let's get rid of all of these cubes and the emitter for that matter too. And here we have the sim. It's ran for a few hundred frames. And, I just wanted to mention this, that you don't have to create a tank if you don't want it. And as far as I'm concerned, if you don't need a tank, don't make a tank. Because there's no problem containing the sim. This way, I only have a domain and an emitter and a volume and a collider. There's no need for, like tank domains. And I mean, no shadow over you if you prefer to use this preset, but in all honesty, I mean, this is done with the best intentions. It's to make the workflow easier. There's a few gotchas when it comes to setting up closed domains for hybrido, so I get why they want to do it, but to me this is just clutter, and it gets confusing. You might one time change the domain and the next time you change the manipulator, which everything else is parented under, and I mean, it just gets too much for me, for my taste. And since this is going to come up, this is a setup we will revisit in upcoming videos, I just wanted to have it said that, you don't have to. So here's my little river sim, and if you want to play around with this, I will put the Geo Collider and the scene on my Patreon page for you. So it's free to download for anyone, subscriber or not. That's that when it comes to open domains. Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about how to make wet maps in Realflow and why you might want to make wet maps. So here, if you take a look at my video here, you'll see that wherever the water has been in contact with the surface, we all of a sudden have a much darker appearance, and maybe it's not too visible in this case because soon it all gets engulfed by the water, but it is also a much more reflective surface, because this is kind of like a dry matte surface, and then when the water has passed by, you expect it to have kind of like a thin film of water, and it has absorbed some water, so it gets darker. Alright, so I just rendered two quick frames to debug this. So now we can see with wet map shading, and this is without. And what do we learn from this? First of all, I might have tinted the liquid shader a bit too aggressive, but there is a huge difference in realism here. And I can guarantee this is exactly the same liquid shader. The only difference is that the underlying material is being, on the rock itself, is being color corrected, so it's slightly darker and it's more reflective in the areas where the wet map is white, so to speak. So let's just look at the surface without the liquid on top of it. Alright, here we go. We're rendering it without the liquid. So it's pretty apparent. I mean, even if we imagine a case where the liquid is not over our collider. So we imagine someone hosing these stairs or this well or front and down and then turning off the water. We definitely expect it to look like this and not like this after the water has disappeared. That's like the main reason. But it's nice that you can also see what kind of a difference this makes, even though it's not entirely apparent. In this case, it makes a huge deal even when it's refracting through. So that is why you want wet maps. Alright, so in the interest of seeing how this works, I simulated out a few frames, so now we have that. And I just want to point out again that even though I have had not so great experience in actually getting the wet maps to work in hybrido, you're supposed to be able to do that. I just find that, there's a lot of stuff going on in the scene. Maybe reading the hybrido domain, even the cache, there's a lot of features in here like ocean displacement and secondaries and whatnot, and I just want the single most less expensive way to generate these wet maps. But I figure I will show you how to set up the wet maps now, and then I will make an independent video on how to actually use them in shading. But in principle, you can ignore that there's a lot of stuff going on in here with triplanar mapping and whatnot. But in principle, whatever renderer you're using, there's going to be like a base color material, and that's the sunlit dry surface in this case. That's the base material. And then there's another material which I have color corrected to be darker, and I made it a lot more reflective. So the roughness is lower and the reflectivity is, basically the roughness is lower. And I graded down the diffuse. And then to blend between those, I have that animated texture coming out of Realflow as a way to blend between the two materials. So let's take a look at what that looks like in my scene here. So here you can actually see it in play. Here is where the water has hit, and you really get like a texture that you can use. So the way I like to set this up, first of all, you gotta have some sort of sense-making UVs. It's best if they're all attached, all of the faces that's going to be touched by water, because there might be some seams issues, and you don't want it to be overly distorted and not overlapping, of course. So I mean, this was a hybrido project. And this is what my hybrido scene looks like. Let's find my collider here. You can see that there's wet dry texture. You can enable that, and you can set the texture resolution and the filter loops. But what I was getting at is, what I like to do is actually take note of the fact that this is high domain 01. If we look at the export central, high domain 01 RPC particles. And that's important, RPC particles, because what I like to do is I like to finish the sim. I'm happy with the sim, or to a state where I want to start rendering the sim. I like to save out a copy of the scene using save as, and then in that copy I will delete everything except for the collider, and then I will create a diverso domain. Why a diverso domain, you might say? Well, the diverso domain also knows how to output wet maps, and the diverso domain also uses RPC particles. And what if the RPC particles are cached? Then we don't need to sim anything. We can just load up pretty much our existing cache if we just name the emitter the same, because Realflow looks for cache files with the naming convention established on the name of the node. So if I just named, you see I have a diverser domain, but I named it HY for hybrido, high domain 01. So let's just get rid of that one. High domain 01, I set it to cache mode. I connected it to collide with the collider geo. I even have the emission geo in here, but I'm not using it because I don't even need an emitter. I just need a domain, and I called it the same, and I put it in cache mode, so you can actually see. So you'll see my hybrido particles loaded on a diverser domain. I just named it the same, which in this case was really easy. Just substitute the D with the H. And then what do we do? So connect it to the collider because they need to be aware of each other, even though it's not an active sim, because it's only going to calculate Wetmaps for areas it's actually colliding with. And then first and foremost, make sure that this has UVs. So let's take a look at what those UVs look like. In this case, really, really simple. I just selected all the stuff on the inside here, this stuff. And I think, if I remember correctly, I just did a planar from the top, and then it's kind of like separate the top lip here, and then the exterior, I believe, or yeah, this is the bottom. This is never going to get in touch with surface, and then the outside. So everything that really is contact with water is in one continuous surface. And I do admit there were some issues like in this area, so maybe that's kind of a little underrepresented here, so maybe I should have redone it, but I think I didn't pay much attention to it. Maybe now that I pointed out you will, but anyway. So UVs loaded in, collider geo, go down to texture. It's a texture rollout, and enable wet dry texture. So it's gonna give you the option to pick a texture resolution. And let's just see where this goes. So you can go into the export central with the F12 key, or export and export central, and then go to objects, collision geo in this case, and wetmap texture, TIFF. So I want to keep those. So let's say I just call it JPEG instead, and we can try baking out a few. So I don't know what the defaults are, but I would guess that it's a lot lower. So let's just try that. You can, let's see, this is diverse, so I don't know if it really utilizes multi-threading very well, but since there's not much going on in the scene, I'm just gonna go ahead and simulate. So you can actually see it starting to appear in front of you. I'm going to uncheck selection highlighting so we can actually tweak this in better. So where the water is, there's now white on the texture, which is going to be where we blend in our material that is lower roughness and darker. So what do we want to do next? I mean, obviously, I arrived at 4096 in this case. Maybe it's not necessary in your case. Maybe let's try 2048 and go again. So you'll see it's a lot more granular now, which is nice, because you want detail in this case. You also don't want to, kind of like, maybe too much granular would be a bad thing, but in this case it seems to be working nicely. I mean, if I were to try and combat, you know, some of these spotty areas, then you might try doing that with filter loops, might try doing that with filter strength. Let's see if there's a difference. To be honest, I oftentimes just end up in default land with most of these settings, aside from the resolution and the aging, I should say. That's something I frequently tweak. So, but I mean, it's something. And I actually did a pass in After Effects as well, but I don't think we're going to get into that today. So let's actually see the real difference. I mean, the main difference is here. I probably should not have done this in this kind of layout, because it's pretty apparent that the first few steps here, like these areas, have a lot more definition because they're bigger, and the further it goes down, the less texel density it has. So I probably should have UV laid this out another way, ideally kind of like the way I did with this piece. But I guess I wanted to avoid some seams, but I think that would probably have been better, because it would have been it wouldn't have been so apparent that the resolution once it gets down here is a little too low. So you're seeing now that once we got up to 4K squared, it's starting to take a little more time per sub-step, but it's nothing compared to the sim itself, of course. And what I then did in After Effects, what I played with the blurring a little bit. I also experimented with some echoing to kind of get more apparent streaks, I think, because in some areas I kind of got the feeling that it was first wet and then it kind of disappeared before more water filled up. And we don't have any more particles in the cache from that. But that's, I mean, in a nutshell, that's how you generate wet maps. So that is why you want wet maps and how to render out wet maps. And I want to make a separate video where I show how to specifically set up the shaders, and I'll cover every renderer that I know in the process. So that'll be at least Arnold, V-Ray, and Redshift, and we'll see. We'll take it from there. That really concludes this first video of the year. I hope you liked it, and if you did, feel free to give the thumbs up. Feel free to head on over to my Patreon to grab a hold of source files for this little tutorial if you want to play around with this collider or the river collider that I showed briefly. And that is it. It's a wrap for the first video of the year. I want to thank you for checking out this tutorial. It means a lot for me to see the views come in and get reactions from you. It would be awesome to see what you can come up with using one of the techniques shown in the video. So if you do want to share your work through social media using one of the accounts shown currently, that would be great. Last but not least, if you find value in my YouTube channel, it would mean a lot for me if you would consider becoming a Patreon of mine and support me. That would help me create more content, learn more software, and make more projects and share it back with all of you. And that is something I'm really passionate about. Thanks for the consideration, and thanks again for checking out this video. I will see you around.